As a young car enthusiast that grew up in the 1990s, some of my favorite automotive designs centered around pop-up headlights, a boxy, wedge-like shape, and of course, this sound. Now, if that wasn't nostalgic enough for you, I want to take you back to the year 1979, when Honda first introduced a sporty two-door Grand Touring coupe to their lineup called the Prelude. Now, at the time, the Prelude was basically nothing more than just a two-door version of the company's venerable four-door Accord family sedan. And over the next 46 years, Honda would eventually use the Prelude name as a technological testbed whenever they wanted to introduce new technologies to the world with each subsequent generation. Now, of course, it's been around 2.5 decades since we've actually seen the Prelude name, and I have to admit here, I'm excited to report that Honda is finally ready to bring back an all-new 6th generation Prelude, also introducing a new the first ever electrified hybrid power plant underneath the hood. Now, we're about a few months away from finally driving the all-new 6th generation Prelude, so today we're actually here at Honda's headquarters in Torrance, California, because we're getting an opportunity to get behind the wheel of all 5 generations of the Prelude, ranging from the 1st generation behind me to that 5th generation, the iconic model that was last discontinued in 2001. Now, since it's been around 2.5 decades since we've actually had the Prelude name here in the States, I thought I'd take you down a walk of memory lane to talk about all the different features and highlights that made the Prelude so popular with enthusiasts back in the day. So if you guys are also interested in knowing more about the upcoming 6th generation Prelude, we're actually going to include a quick little walk around later on in the video. But obviously, since we have all 5 generations of the Prelude to talk about, let's go ahead and go into some of the specs for these vehicles and also talk about what technological feature each generation actually brought when it was introduced. Let's first, of course, start with the 1st generation Prelude. This was first introduced back in 1979. It ran all the way up to around 1982. And as you can see, what this vehicle actually brought was a power sunroof. This was the first Honda vehicle to be introduced in America that had a sunroof. In fact, every Prelude after this generation came standard with a sunroof, so a sunroof was the technological highlight. Now, underneath the hood of this particular model that we're showing you here, you're gonna find a carbureted engine, a 3-barrel carburetor. It's a 1.8 liter single overhead cam CVCC engine. Now, if you guys remember, this vehicle has that CVCC technology, which allowed it to be one of the cleanest burning engines of its time. And the horsepower figures, remember, this is in 1979, just 72 horsepower and 94 pound-feet of torque. This model that we're showing you here has a 5-speed manual, but when it first came out, you could get it with a 2-speed Honda-matic transmission. Later on, it became available with a 3-speed automatic. All Preludes, of course, were front-wheel drive, and as you can see, the clamshell hood is just super cool. It definitely gives you, a feeling of a car that was essentially offered in the 1970s. Now, in terms of the design, you can see this reminds me a lot from the Civic and the Accord of the same era. Remember, Honda got started here in America back in 1970. This came to the market around 9 years later. I love, again, the glass headlights that you find there, that traditional boxy rectangular shape. No Honda logo, of course, it just has the Honda, brand stamped in the actual grille. These bumpers are a mixture of, it feels like aluminum or steel and some plastic pieces. Of course, it still had features like headlights, like turn signals, of course, and the black painted bumper with the silver trim just, to me, screams like a classic car back from the 1970s. The wheels on this vehicle, this is kind of where we'll talk about the new one later on, because these are, if you can believe it, 13-inch wheels. That's right, 13-inch wheels. It really shows you how ridiculously big wheels have become over the years. It's a 175 by 70 R13 tire. You still have disc brakes, along with drum brakes at the back. No anti-lock brakes, of course, were even offered on this generation. Remember, this was a much more simpler time back in the day. This vehicle was also around 161 inches long, which I believe is around the same length as something like a Miata in today's day and age. So it's a pretty small car. Now, of course, moving over to the 2nd generation, this is where we saw a radical change for the Prelude because it was built off of an all-new platform. As you can see, it still has the clamshell hood, and this particular model that we're showing you also has a carbureted engine. However, Honda went to a dual carburetor as opposed to a 3-barrel carburetor for the 1st generation. It's still a 1.8 liter single overhead cam 12-valve engine that made about 100 horsepower and 109 pound-feet of torque. A 5-speed manual was the standard transmission. That's what this car has, but you could also get it with a 4-speed automatic transmission. So again, front-wheel drive was the only available drivetrain configuration for this vehicle. Now, I noticed Honda added a prop rod here, which the 1st generation didn't have, but When you close up the hood, the big technological highlight with this generation, however, was the fact that Honda added a double wishbone front suspension for this vehicle. And that was some sophisticated suspension tech for this car. Although it did have a McPherson strut rear, the Accord of this generation actually had double wishbone front and rear, and that really improved the handling. This was also the generation of Prelude that added the pop-up headlights. So those pop-up headlights, every time you turn the headlights on, you can see they're mechanical. They really affected the aerodynamics when they were on, but I have to say they just look really cool. And you can also see the headlights, obviously they're halogens. You have the new Honda logo here, which has their H badge. The bumper has kind of like a new design, obviously, where you have mostly plastic, and you can see the front end looks completely different. This, to me, when it first came out in 1983, was, I think, personally, a very avant-garde design. It really showed that Honda worked a lot on this vehicle in the 1980s, and it has a completely different look and a completely different feel. Now, let's move on to the third generation Prelude, because this was introduced back in 1988. And this is the one that actually inspired the design for the Acura NSX. Remember, the NSX came to the market back in 1990, and this is also the first Prelude to introduce fuel injection to the engine. So this model that we're showing you here is an SI. It has a 2-liter double overhead cam fuel injected 4-cylinder engine that made 135 horsepower and 127 pound-feet of torque. Now in 1991, Honda actually updated the Prelude with a refresh. They increased the size of the SI to 2.1 liters, and it also increased the horsepower to around 140 horsepower and 135 foot-pounds of torque. This model surprisingly has a 4-speed automatic. That's right. For those of you who thought that every Honda branded SI performance vehicle actually had a manual transmission, this model actually had a 4-speed sequential sport shift automatic transmission. So it's kind of some sophisticated tech back in the day, but you could also get it, of course, with a 5-speed manual if you preferred. The big story with this model in which it introduced was the 4-wheel steering system. So if you guys remember, 4-wheel steering wasn't really a big thing back in the day, but Honda was the first manufacturer to come to market with 4-wheel steering. It was a mechanical 4-wheel steering that could essentially turn the wheels in either the same or the opposite direction, depending on how far you were turning the actual wheel. And it was some sophisticated technology. You can see it was kind of an evolutionary change with the design. You still had pop-up headlights, but the front end to me is a lot smoother and cleaner. The aerodynamics of this vehicle, I believe, was 0.34 back in the day. I really like how Honda gave it like a full paint finish. You have a smaller grille, less kind of plasticky trim around the headlights. And you can also see this model has fog lights, which I love the fact that it has the halogen headlights and of course the fog lights. If you want to turn them on, you can see they also are hydraulically powered, and it looks really cool. You still have that same kind of glass halogen headlight, which I feel like every manufacturer used this square headlight back in the day. So that to me is also nostalgia. The sunroof, as you guys know, is standard on every Prelude, and in this black exterior color. The wheels on this model here, you can see Honda actually made the wheels bigger. So these are a 14-inch wheel riding on a 195 by 60. It's actually got a plastic wheel cover on it. So it got an inch bigger because the second gen, I forgot to mention, had a 13-inch wheel. So this is kind of where you start to see the generations and the styling updates change significantly, although this is still pretty small by modern day standards. Now, of course, another radical change came in 1992 when this generation Prelude came out, the 4th generation Prelude. And this is the model that really started to kind of, I guess, bring the power to the Prelude generations or the Prelude world, because this was the first time that you could get VTEC, the company's patented variable valve timing exhaust lift system that really improved the power of this model. This model that we're showing you here technically does not have VTEC because this is the Prelude with 4-wheel steering. So it has a 2.3 liter double overhead cam 4-cylinder. It's part of the H series engine family known as the H23A1. And in this application makes 160 horsepower, which is honestly a pretty good amount of power, because remember, the old Prelude SI from the previous generation had just 140 horsepower at its max. This model is available, of course, with a 5-speed manual or a 4-speed automatic transmission. But if you got the VTEC version, but you couldn't get VTEC with 4-wheel steering together, so basically it was called Prelude VTEC, that offered up to 190 horsepower. And in a car back in 1993, 190 horsepower was a ton of power. As you guys also know, fuel-injected engine as well. Now, in terms of the exterior design for this Prelude, let me go ahead and close up the hood. This has also been a radical shift for the Prelude because Honda got rid of the pop-up headlights, which honestly was an iconic styling detail. But of course, as we moved into the 90s, that more curvaceous futuristic body became more of the norm. You can see the headlights are plastic. Actually, no, they're actually not. They're glass still. And they have that kind of like sinister more look to them. You have some functional openings there. The grille for the vehicle obviously is not really here, but you have like a lower area here with the turn signals down here. I love the full paint finish. And overall, this generation, to me, actually had the nicest interior, which we'll talk about the interior later on. But I am shocked to see how good this generation still looks. It looks like such a huge radical change from the previous generation. And when you also look at the wheels, Honda went a little bit bigger this year for the wheels. These are a 15-inch alloy. Of course, wrapped in an even fatter 205 by 65, or 55, I'm sorry, series rubber. So this is definitely going to help with grip. Of course, you also had the availability of anti-lock brakes, which anti-lock brakes was first offered on the 3rd generation. It became standard at some point when you got to the last generation model. This model was still, I believe, an optional feature. Now, of course, that brings us to the final 5th generation of the Prelude. This was introduced back in 1997, discontinued in 2001. This is the one that, for me personally, I was kind of always salivating over as a kid in high school. And it also has the engine that a lot of enthusiasts covet. This is the H22A4. So it's a 2.2 liter double overhead cam VTEC 4-cylinder that made 195 horsepower when it first came out. And then in 1999, Honda actually improved the power to 200 horsepower with the manual, which is what this model has here, or 195 when you had the automatic. So there was a 4-speed automatic or a 5-speed manual. All Preludes, again, remained front-wheel drive, but this application here with 200 horsepower, 2.2 liters, this is a legendary motor that had so much tuning potential that a lot of people really just loved this generation of Prelude. I also personally love the styling of this model, because when you look at the design of this vehicle, I think it's actually aged extremely well. I mean, obviously there are some elements here to remind you that it's a 25-plus-year-old car, a 30-year-old car almost, but the headlights, as you can see, now they went to the actual plastic headlight design. You have an actual larger grille with the Prelude badge in the actual grille. You still have the separate design for the turn signals. No fog lights on this model, although I think Honda may have offered it as a accessory from the dealership. And this color, I believe, is called Crystal Blue Metallic. I actually have driven this Prelude before. If you guys remember, there was 5 years ago, this vehicle was actually in the fleet in my local area in Virginia, but here we are back in California because Honda, again, has left this vehicle part of their museum fleet. But I love the fact that it still has that long nose design, even though it's a transverse engine, and it has that classic wedge shape. In fact, Honda actually kind of carried over the more boxier shape of the previous generations, but they combined it with more modern styling elements. But let me know in the comment section below which design you guys actually prefer. Also, the wheels, this had the biggest wheels available at the time for the Prelude, a 16-inch wheel, as you can see, wrapped in a 205. So still a 205 by 50 R16 Yokohama rubber. You can also see all disc brakes on this generation, and you also had standard anti-lock brakes. So this is a time where technology was starting to move forward. And speaking of technology, this generation of the Prelude was known for a system called ATTS. It was the first vehicle to get it, which stood for Active Torque Transfer System. If you guys are familiar with Acura's super handling all-wheel drive, this is essentially the earlier iteration of it, because this allowed the front-wheel drive Prelude to essentially send more torque to the outside wheel to counteract understeer that you typically feel with front-wheel drive models. I hear, however, actually, I have experience driving this vehicle. This generation Prelude was a pretty nose-heavy vehicle at around 64% of the bias on the front axle, so it didn't really always do a great job at masking the fact that it was a nose-heavy front-wheel drive vehicle. But still, this model removed the four-wheel steering, which was on the 3rd and the 4th generation. I forgot to mention the 4th generation also had electronic four-wheel steering system versus the mechanical system in the 3rd generation. Now, also moving on to the new version, this is kind of where Honda is going a completely different route, because all of these models here are essentially naturally aspirated 4-cylinders with no kind of forced induction, no kind of electrical assistance. The new generation Prelude is going to use the 2-liter 4-cylinder engine from the current Civic Hybrid. It's essentially a 2-motor hybrid system, and the total output figures Honda says are 200 horsepower and 232 foot-pounds of torque. Now, I also want to point out it's been around 25 years since we've seen a Prelude in the States, and this generation left with 200 horsepower, while the new Prelude also has 200 horsepower, which doesn't sound great on paper. Now, of course, it has significantly more torque. This only had 156 foot-pounds of torque versus 232 in the new Prelude. And it also is not available with a manual transmission. All of it goes out through an eCVT, which is technically more of a single-speed transmission with a 2-speed lockup. It's got a new Sport Plus setting, which Honda says basically mimics shifts, creates a synthesized sound. I'll be looking forward to driving that at some point. What we don't know, however, is the curb weight of the new Prelude, which I imagine is going to be heavier because it's a hybrid. If you guys remember, the 1st generation Prelude only weighed in at around 1,900 pounds. moving down the line here, this generation, the 5th generation that I'm standing by, had a curb weight of around 2,900 pounds. So I suspect the new generation Prelude is probably going to be 500 pounds heavier than this vehicle here. But again, at least it has more torque, and it's also, you know, got 2 electric motors, which should help kind of mitigate the additional weight gain. But we're looking forward to driving that vehicle sometime in early January. Now, coupes were very popular back in the day, but they also still required a decent amount of practicality, and this is where Honda actually still sold the Prelude as more of like a grand touring style coupe. As you can see, the 1st generation model actually had a pretty decent size trunk. I mean, just check out how wide the opening is. I don't actually know what the cargo figure is like, but surprisingly, for a vehicle that's only 161 inches on the outside, there is a plenty of space. It's a very deep trunk. It's also got a very large opening. Unfortunately, it does have a pretty high liftover, and it's a design that Honda actually fixed as we go down the generations. But closing the back, you can see the design also kind of has that blocky shape that we first saw in the front of the vehicle. The taillights, as you can see, have like a mimic design for the rectangular look. You have your usual lights here for the brake light, the reverse light, and then the amber turn signals. The bumper also is kind of like a combination of plastic with metal. And you can see there's this cute little singular exhaust tip out the back, which is something that the new version, which we'll talk about later, doesn't actually have. Now, moving on to the 2nd generation of the Prelude. Again, this was such a radical departure, but there are a couple of elements here that Honda kept. As you can see, it still has that kind of high liftover height because this little area here doesn't actually get removed when you open up the trunk. I don't have, again, the cargo figures of this particular model here, but you can see it's pretty deep. It actually doesn't look quite as big as the 1st generation Prelude, which I imagine has to do with the completely different shape of the vehicle. This was, again, a much more aerodynamic design, whereas that model was a much more blocky design that kind of went with the era of the vehicle. As I close the trunk area, as you can see, the look is definitely, for me, a lot cleaner. I love how it has, you know, Prelude stamped along the rear of the vehicle. You have still that cute little singular exhaust. You've got the two-tone look with the kind of black and gray painted bumpers, which kind of clash really nicely with the red exterior. You can see there's also a little 5-speed badge to let everybody know that you have a manual transmission, and this model also didn't have the Honda logo at the back. Instead, it just had the older script where it actually spelled out Honda at the rear. Overall, I think this design definitely still looks pretty good, which brings me to the 3rd generation model, because remember, this was an evolutionary change from the 2nd generation. As you can see, the higher liftover still continues for this generation, and I also noticed the trunk doesn't look quite as big. Again, in terms of the dimensional size, Honda actually says this model had around 7.9 cubic feet of storage space, which is actually pretty decent considering this generation of Prelude was still only around 175 inches long. It actually got significantly bigger for this generation versus the previous model. And then when you close up the trunk, you can see you kind of have almost like a full-length LED taillight bar, which has now become a huge trendy thing. Although it's not technically the same thing. It looks like it's illuminated, but it's technically not. There is a 2-liter SI badge because it's the SI model. Honda also combined the H logo back here with the Honda badge at the rear. And then you can see the full paint finish for the rear bumper certainly looks a lot more classy. And Honda also went to a single dual outlet exhaust with chrome tips. It certainly gave the Prelude a much sportier design. In fact, the rear of this car, I really like the look. It reminds me a lot of the Acura Legend back in the day, which doesn't surprise me. Acura can, of course, use this design as the inspiration for the 1st generation NSX. Now, moving over to the 4th generation, this is also a radical departure from that generation there, because back in the 90s, that boxy wedge shape was kind of going away and we were going to more of a curvaceous design. You can see the trunk completely looks different for this model, and Honda says the trunk capacity for this version was around 7 cubic feet of storage space. You can see there are hinges that crush your cargo. The opening looks a little bit larger because they actually made the liftover height a little bit lower, but at the same time, it's not quite as wide, so kind of keep that in mind. You do have a little pass-through there for the trunk, and surprisingly, there is a little underfloor storage with a temporary spare tire, which is obviously a nice touch. But what I love about this generation Prelude is the triangular taillights back here. It also came with a nice wing spoiler at the back, which I feel like you could also get a wing spoiler on the 3rd generation, but with the design of the taillights with that triangular shape, the Prelude badge here in that cursive script, which looks pretty nice. I mean, this is the generation that introduced the cursive script. And then also you have their electronic 4-wheel steering. That's what 4WS stood for. But again, this model here was electronic, that generation was mechanical. The one that we're showing you there technically doesn't have the four-wheel steering option. Now looking at the exhaust tip, you can see that twin outlet chrome tip, or dual chrome exhaust tip carries over along with the full paint finish. And this definitely had more of like a Fast and a Furious racing look to it. So for me personally, I actually really like the design of this 4th generation model. Now, of course, the 5th and final generation of the Prelude, as you can see, has a trunk that appears to have a higher liftover height versus that generation Prelude. Honda said you had around 7.9 cubic feet of storage space. Again, hinges still crush your cargo. And the company also gave you a completely fold down back seat back here, so you could actually expand the cargo into the back seat area, which was nice. You also had a temporary spare underneath here with additional underfloor storage, which is great. But the opening you can see is actually the smallest. So it kind of shows you how new cars or cars over the years actually had their trunk openings get smaller and smaller. As I close the trunk area, you can see that spoiler, that wing spoiler looks really good. In fact, this generation Prelude to me gives me more of the Fast and the Furious vibes. It's a really nice looking design from, going from the triangular taillights to these more wider rectangular taillights. You can see you've got the Prelude badge back here, but without the cursive script, which the new version actually has. So this generation actually got rid of it. And then of course there's the Type SH badge, because there was essentially a base Prelude and then the Type SH, which stood for super handling, but not super handling all-wheel drive. It just had that active torque transfer system. You can see the rear bumper has that nice clean blockier shape to it, along with the dual chrome exhaust tips. Overall, I think this is probably my favorite design in terms of the Prelude. That one would probably be my next favorite. But I mean, styling is always a subjective thing, so let me know in the comment section below which of the rear designs for these generations you actually prefer. Now, I also want to point out that the new generation is very different from these, because as you guys saw, these had conventional trunks, but the new version actually is a hatchback, which significantly improves the cargo capacity, but it also removes one crucial feature that every Prelude generation has had, which is a sunroof. Now, of course, we couldn't talk about all these generations of Preludes without actually showing you guys a brief tour of the interior. We're going to start, of course, with the 1st generation, wholly like orange velour interior. This is actually kind of making a comeback in a lot of new modern cars today, but it really just takes you back in time. I love the simplicity, because back in the day, Honda, remember, liked to keep things simple. As I shut the door, I want you guys to basically listen to each of the door slams and tell me which one you guys like the most. And of course, we're gonna start the vehicle up. Here's the key for the vehicle. Obviously, no intelligent access key. You have to use this very simple key and stick it in the ignition. And also, listen to that chime. That is the earliest, Honda chimes, which is very different from the 90s that I really like. 5-speed manual. Oh yes. A carbureted engine, which required a little bit of revs, and also to remember that I left it in, that it was in 1st gear. So that's with it in neutral, but the car didn't stall at least. But listen to it. It still purrs and sounds really nice. Remember, this is a 1.8 liter 4-cylinder. Now, the reason why it keeps making that chiming noise is because Rob needs to leave the door open, so try to ignore that. But I want to talk about a couple of things with this interior. First of all, the steering wheel is huge. It's got a very thin rim, which a lot of modern cars have really thick steering wheel rims. The horns are buttons, and it actually sounds kind of cute with the little toot. You can kind of adjust that. You have manual hand crank windows, as you can see, which don't even think about trying to find power windows in a vehicle like this. What I like about this car, thank you, Rob, for showing the door, is just how simple everything is. The dash feels pretty low. It's also kind of right there within reach. You have simple controls for your climate controls. You actually have a cigarette lighter with an ashtray, obviously. And then with the instrument cluster here, this was very controversial back in the day, because Honda essentially combined the tachometer and the speedometer in a single bezel that kind of had like 2 dials that kind of rotated. It's an interesting look that takes some getting used to, but it also kind of reminds you of the era of Honda back in the day. The wheel itself, I think, is proportionally too large for the actual rest of the interior, but as you can see, there's still a sunroof in this model, which is not something you get in the new version. The shifter is definitely a little, not as precise as, Hondas from later in the eras, but it's also just a satisfying shifter as well with a mechanical handbrake. I also noticed the door panels don't actually have any additional storage aside from just this little grab handle here. There's no storage pockets, no power windows, obviously. And then you also have a glove box, which just kind of falls. It is surprisingly lined with felt. It offers a decent amount of additional storage. But overall, this vehicle back in the day kind of feels like you have really good visibility. There isn't really much out here in this interior kind of crowding your interior space. So it's a really interesting, design and feel that I think a lot of people, especially if you grew up in this era, are gonna find a lot of nostalgia with this interior. Now moving on to the interior of the second generation Prelude, as you can see, this is quite a change because the exterior got a lot of radical design differences. This is also where Honda made the interior. Actually, I think the visibility is better. The dash I'm noticing is even lower. I really like this kind of storage shelf that you got on this portion of the dash. The materials are also soft touch, but they feel a little bit higher quality. I like the grading material with actual faux stitching. This is actually a feature that I wasn't aware was actually in cars back in the 1980s. As I shut the door has a different thunk. Let me know if you guys like the sound of this or the first generation. And then you can see this is the key that I knew very well back when I was a kid growing up because my dad had a 1990 Civic. Obviously, I think it's a better looking key than the first generation, but this is also the year where Honda added their trademark chime. So this chime I really appreciate. And then this test car also has a manual. I'll remember to take it out of gear this time, but it's still a carbureted engine, but it actually started a lot easier. Now, of course, that vehicle that we were just in is 46 years old, but I like the sound of that. That definitely has that, revvy, smooth, linear powertrain that Honda is very much known for. The steering wheel is certainly very different in this car. It's a really interesting shape, 3-spoke design, but it has this weird kind of stack that you can see. No airbag for this model, but now instead of the horn buttons, you just have one horn, and interesting sound as well to the little toot for the horn. The steering wheel, as you can see, surprisingly actually doesn't have any adjustments. I was actually kind of thinking it would actually adjust, but the instrument panel got a lot more simple in this model. You have like the traditional analog with the separate dials now for the tachometer and the speedo. It's a very simplistic look. This model actually only has 372 miles on it. That's right, 372 miles on a car that was built in 1983. This vehicle is actually older than you, Rob, by 2 years, and it actually has only 300 miles, and I just had to throw that in. But I also love the thin A-pillars. You've got the low cowl design here for the dash, and of course the door panels. Honda did add some storage here for the door pockets. You can see there's a little bit more storage here and storage here. You still have hand crank windows, obviously, and this generation also added a side view mirror on the passenger side. That actually wasn't there for the first gen because I don't think it was actually a requirement. But obviously this model was succumbed to a lot of the newer safety regulations that came out in the 1980s. These seats are also wild. They still have like that velour feel to them with this kind of 90s texture for the insert. They also look very strange, but they're surprisingly comfortable and supportive. You still have a traditional handbrake. No radio in this model, surprisingly, but I think it's because it's a DX trim, and back in the day the DX trim didn't have a radio. It also didn't have air conditioning, as you can see, but you still have lots of simple controls here, which I love. Cigarette lighter, of course, which actually does still work, I believe. No ashtray, at least I don't really think there's an ashtray. There is a little hidden storage compartment here on the left side of the actual dash, but no actual ashtray on this. Actually, here's the ashtray right there. But the glove box, as you can see, open that up. It's a little smaller than the first generation, but it's still lined with felt, which is a nice touch. And you can also see that clock. That's a very trademark thing with Hondas. You'll see in the next generation Preludes, they'll still have that clock. The sunroof, as you can see, still lets in lots of light. And just like the first generation, you still had a back seat. But overall, it was definitely a radical departure, but I'm really loving the increase in visibility that you get with the second generation. Now moving into the third generation of the Prelude, just like on the outside, which was more of an evolutionary change, the interior kind of had that same deal here. It still has excellent sight lines. In fact, the dash feels just as low. You still have that little nice storage shelf at the top of the dash, same soft touch injection molded plastic materials, but there's none of that faux stitching. And then of course we get a new steering wheel. This is a much better looking steering wheel in my eyes. Still no airbags. Honda eventually added airbags for the next generation, I believe, but the horn, it actually has a slightly different tone to it, but I appreciate how it's just, again, the actual pad here is the horn as opposed to the buttons. As I shut the door, I think the door sounds a little better on this model versus the second and first generation, but as you can see, here's the key fob for the vehicle. It hasn't changed. It's not even a key fob, it's just a key. But you stick the ignition, or the key in the ignition. This one actually has an automatic, as you can see. It has that trademark Honda chime. And then of course with fuel injection, the engine is just smoother. It starts up a lot easier. This was the generation that got the fuel injection at some point. So the engine itself, oh yes, that is just music to my ears. Love that sound, but we'll kind of it'll get even better as we go down the generation lines. Now you can see a 4-speed automatic is not something that I typically see in an SI branded vehicle. There's actually, the traditional PRND. There's also a sport mode here, an S4 mode, which I believe locks it out of overdrive. And then there's like a 2 mode here. No manual shift mode or paddles or like Sportronic shifting here, but it certainly was some pretty impressive technology back in the day. The seats, you can see, have that same cloth velour, and they actually have the same kind of look to them. They're surprisingly comfortable and supportive. The backseat area also is still pretty usable, although it's also pretty small, but at least it's still offered a backseat. And then you can see the sunroof is a nice touch. It really lets in a lot of light. You can also open it up to vent air. But overall, this interior definitely felt more like an evolutionary change. I love the gauge display also. This reminds me a lot of my dad's Civic back in the 1990s with the clean, simple look to it. Some of the electronics have been updated with the actual display that shows you which door is open. But you really can't beat kind of the simple, timeless look of the 3 dials for the instrument cluster. But overall, this could be my favorite interior, at least until we hop into the 4th and 5th generation, because the 4th gen especially got a radical change. Now, as I hop into the interior of the 4th generation Prelude, this is kind of where Honda wanted to take a lot more risk here. In fact, this interior is known for being the most futuristic and the most luxurious. As you guys can see, this is the only trim or only version of the Prelude that we have here that actually has leather bucket seats. They look like they were pulled out of an Acura Legend, for example. They're actually perforated. The leather also feels really supple. I love the way the seats look and feel. They're super comfortable. And then with the key fob, you can see Honda gave it a new key. I believe this is the generation where they eventually started adding their immobilizer anti-theft key. But when you stick the key in the ignition, you can see it still has that trademark Honda chime. Now, as I shut the door has a little bit of a different thunk sound to it, which again, it's a completely different architecture. But when you want to start the vehicle up, this is kind of where you're going to notice on the interior side, the gauge display looks very different. Now, 5-speed manual, when I start the car up, oh, love that sound. That, to me, I could hear that sound from a mile away if I could actually hear it from that far. And I knew it was a Honda. So that's just a very trademark sound. The engine as well. This one definitely sounds like it revs a lot freer, because remember, this is the H series motor. Even though it's the H23 without VTEC, it still made 160 horsepower back in the day. Now, as you can also see, new steering wheel. This generation was the generation that added airbags, and then eventually they came standard with dual front airbags. You went back to the horn buttons, as you can see, but the horn also has, I think, a louder tone to it. The wheel itself, finally, I think, has a telescoping wheel, or I'm sorry, just a tilt wheel, although I can't actually get it to move right now, so there it goes. So this is kind of where, it's not always the easiest to get a comfortable driving position with modern cars having the telescope function, but check out that gauge display, guys. It has kind of a mixture of an analog illuminated green display along with the digital display there that kind of went across the center of the dash. This was controversial back in the day, but I have to say I kind of like it because it put the gauge display kind of right or in your line of sight. I also like the fact that it's kind of spread out. The green color is also very nostalgic to me. You still kind of had the lower dash, but Honda got rid of the actual storage shelf that you had on the upper part of the dash. You still have very simple controls along with a cassette deck as well. Air conditioning was also included on the 3rd generation, and this generation also included power windows, which technically the 3rd generation had, but this was actually standard equipment on all the Preludes, which kind of showed you its more luxury car feel that Honda was going with. You can see the leather on the door panel feels really nice. You have some storage pockets here, of course. Dash vents are located here in the door pockets as well. And the shifter, I love this shifter. It actually reminds me a lot of the 5th generation Accord, along with still getting a cup holder over here. So a pull style handbrake. And then you can see the center console offers additional storage here. I'm surprised there's a blank row of buttons here, although this is probably a model that is missing some features. And then above me, this is where Honda went to a steel sunroof. So there is no retractable shade here because there's no glass portion. So if you want to open up the roof, you actually have to push a button here. And this actually opens up the roof and takes the roof, or it actually makes the roof panel go over the rear of the vehicle as opposed to going inside the interior and taking up space. But this is kind of like a small change that Honda made, but at least the sunroof is standard equipment. In terms of the glove box, you can see it's actually a little twist tab here, and the glove box got a little bit smaller. It actually goes into the dash instead of being like a bin style. But overall, as you can see, this interior definitely had a more luxury premium feel to it, but it was a very controversial change with the new gauge display. But I have to admit, I actually kind of like it because it reminds me a lot of the 5th generation Honda Accord. Now, moving into the 5th and final generation of the Prelude, this is where Honda decided to go back with a more simpler design. They got rid of a lot of the luxury car vibes from the 4th generation, but they also brought back a much more cohesive look, especially for the instrument cluster with the 2-dial, or the 2 traditional dials with the separate dials, of course, for your fuel and your temperature display. This steering wheel looks like it was lifted out of a 6th generation Civic right down to the actual horn buttons, which Actually sounds pretty much the same as the Civic from that same era. You can see the key fob for the vehicle. This is Honda's, again, moving to their newer key, which I believe this actually is the one that had the immobilizer key. The fourth generation didn't have that, but you also got factory keyless entry as well. So this is a key fob that I remember very, very well from my 2001 Accord that I had back in the day. As I shut the door also has a slightly different sound to it when you shut it, but now that you've heard all 5 doors, let me know which door thunk you think actually sounds the best. When you stick the key in the ignition, it has that trademark, of course, Honda chime that we all know and love. And then this model, thankfully, is the Type SH, which only came with the 5-speed manual. And as you guys hear that legendary H22 purr, this is definitely the most refined car. In fact, you can basically drive this vehicle like a typical modern car. It has a 7,500 RPM Redline, and you'll really hear that VTEC crossover at around 5,200 RPM. Remember, this model makes 200 horsepower, which back in the day, from just 2.2 liters was some pretty impressive stuff. Now, in terms of the rest of this interior, while it didn't have the luxury car feel of the 4th generation, it still had some pretty decent materials. Soft touch here for the upper door panel. I love the chrome accents here for the a door handle itself. You still have some storage cubbies in the seats. The window controls there, one touch down for just the driver's side, and you also still had just a tilt wheel, which I think the driving position was a little bit better in this model. The dash still feels nice and low, but what I don't like are all the different panels that you see. You can see it kind of creates a few gaps here and there as you start looking around the interior, but you have dual airbags as standard. You have a soft touch injection molded plastic. You still have this little digital clock here, of course, and then you have the simple controls here for the single zone climate. Instead of your tape deck, Honda decided to go to a CD player, which again, that's kind of when CDs were taking popularity. And you can see there's also the option of a double DIN if you guys would like. There is no cigarette lighter, at least. It now just goes to a 12-volt power outlet. And the shifter, I love the way the shifter looks in the feel, and it has that typical snickety snick feel that people love about Hondas. You have dual cup holders now as opposed to just one cup holder, and then you can see padded center console armrests, which actually offered pretty decent storage area and 2 different levels of storage. So you can really see how Honda is improving the ergonomics of this vehicle. The seats also have a completely different look and feel. I think they would have been better in leather, but this cloth material also looks pretty interesting and snazzy. The floor mats, you can see, have a really interesting texture in them. The 4th gen floor mats actually looked even better, but the glove box, you can see, is huge. This has actually looked a lot better in general. And check it out, this is the original window sticker for the vehicle, but it doesn't actually have any price there because this model here actually was the same vehicle that I tested 5 years ago. 2227 MPG was actually not bad back in the day considering the power that this car gave you. Honda also went back to a glass panel for the sunroof, which still opens up electronically, and you also have a back seat that you can use for smaller kids. But overall, this interior lost the luxury car feel. But let me know in the comment section below which interior is your favorite. I think the 4th gen might actually be my favorite for its luxury feel, but I also really appreciate just how simple this interior is. You can kind of get in the vehicle, you know how to use everything, and it also still felt relatively high quality. So while the older Preludes have a ton of heritage behind them, this spot here is probably the one you've been waiting for. It's the new version. We've waited 25 years for Honda to give us an all-new Prelude. So obviously when they had this much time, you probably have some really high expectations. As you can see, the look of this car definitely is very different versus the iconic 5th generation model. But at the same time, I see some of the Prelude heritage here. You can see this exterior color is called Winter Frost Pearl. It's a new color for Honda this year. This model that we're showing you has a little bit of the Honda accessories. The headlights, as you can see, have the modern look to them with the projector style full LEDs. The turn signals are LEDs. The headlights, the high and low beams are LEDs. I like how Honda offers different logos for the front grille. This is for the front Honda logo. You can see this is the upgraded or the unique black badge logo. That's actually their newer logo system. And then this model also has a more aggressive front splitter system. This vehicle in general, as you can see, is actually a lot longer than the previous generations, but Honda didn't have final dimensions for us just yet. To me, it almost looks like an Accord coupe as opposed to a Civic coupe. The older Preludes were definitely a lot smaller. This has that elongated GT-like look to it. Now, as you can see, the wheels are so much bigger on the new model. These are 19-inch wheels. That's standard. It's basically borrowed from the Type R in terms of its front suspension system, its adaptive dampers. You got 13.8-inch rotors. I mean, those brakes are almost as big as the wheels that you found on the 1st generation Prelude. So that kind of shows how we've gone in terms of progress. I mentioned earlier adaptive dampers tuned specifically for the Prelude for more comfort. but with the blue painted calipers, it gives this vehicle a much more modern, distinctive look. Now, one area that really annoys the crap out of me is you can't get a sunroof on the Prelude anymore, which is something that the previous models have had for every generation. So let me know in the comment section below if that kind of annoys you a little bit. I want to show you guys the interior. First of all, the door handles, they actually pop out. When you lock and unlock the vehicle, they pop out like this, which kind of reminds me of a Lexus LC500. So once they are popping out like that, you basically pull the door handle to reveal the interior. Now, unlike obviously the older Preludes, this is a modern interior with modern infotainment systems. The driver faces a fully digital 10.2-inch cluster, and of course to the right you have a 9-inch display which includes wireless Apple CarPlay and Android Auto. Now of course that screen looks very modern and sophisticated compared to old Preludes, but it also is a little bit on the small side compared to its rivals. I love the seats and this two-tone interior color. The seats are unique to this new generation Prelude. It's kind of like a blue and white color combination. They're also heated. I am sad to see that there are no power seats on this model, which I was kind of expecting Honda to do, to kind of just bring this model into a more upscale era, because it certainly has that vibe from the outside. Now moving over to the rear design certainly is very distinctive. It's got the typical design trends that are, in effect today. You've got that modern LED light bar that every other brand is doing. You've got the new Honda script at the back here that also is combined with the old Prelude logo, which kind of looks interesting. I think it's a unique look to it. The rear bumper also has a lot of gloss black with a more aggressive diffuser. I would have liked to see some kind of twin outlet exhaust. That's something that the Prelude has always had, but obviously this is a hybrid, so Honda wanted to show it to be a little bit of a cleaner vehicle. Now, what makes this new Prelude super special is the fact that this is now a liftback. The fact that it's a liftback allows you to put a lot more items in this vehicle to increase the practicality. Obviously, Honda has loaded this vehicle up with a golf bag, of course, with a reasonably sized duffel or roller bag to show off the cargo flexibility. So this is again going to be a game changer if you plan to use this vehicle as your only vehicle. So that's one of the reasons why the new Prelude certainly looks the way it does and why it doesn't have a sunroof, because the roof panel is pretty small. But let me know in the comment section below, did Honda do a pretty good job with the new generation Prelude? Now, you can't start a heritage drive of all these Preludes without actually driving the original model. And I have to say, driving around in a car that was built in 1979 is a very interesting experience. I mean, this is before my time. This vehicle was around about 10 years before I was even born. So driving around in this vehicle, which has a 1.8 liter single overhead cam, 12 valve, carbureted 4-cylinder engine. Remember, this car only has 72 horsepower, which is not a lot of power, but I have to say, it's still a relatively easy vehicle to drive. I love the shifter in this car. It's a little rubbery and it has very long throws, but there's something about this car that just feels very, very classic. It has so much mechanical feel to it. There's just so much nostalgia when I drive this vehicle. And I have to also say the instrument panel for this car is certainly strange. I'm not used to seeing a single dial for the tach on the inside with a speedometer on the outside, but of course with only 70 horsepower, this thing's not very fast. I mean, I think back in the day, this car would probably take around, I want to say 18, 19 seconds to get to 60. And even though this model that we're driving has only 19,000 miles on the odometer, it surprisingly still feels very tight. I mean, the steering, as you can see, is totally manual. There's no power steering in this vehicle, but when a car only weighs like 2,000 pounds, you don't really need power steering. It just feels incredibly light. The shifter goes through the gates really nicely. The clutch has a squeaky sound to it. I don't even know if this is the original clutch or whatnot. It has so little miles on it, I wouldn't be surprised if it was the original clutch. But overall, I think that it's a really interesting design, this car. I really think it's just a really weird feeling to drive something that's this old. The one thing I don't like is the fact that this car does not have a passenger side mirror. I just think it wasn't really a thing back in the day. Let's go ahead and make the U-turn here. You can really feel, you gotta muscle that wheel to kind of get it to turn when you're not moving at higher speeds. You're gonna have to kind of play with the wheel a little bit more, but it has a surprisingly good ride quality. The engine still likes to rev. It just doesn't have that much power when you actually are pushing it. Past this trucker here, 5,000 RPM, but you know what? It actually gets up to speed nicely. I can see why people really like the way Hondas drove back in the day here, because it has a playful feel to it. It has that mechanical, this like mechanical lineage that you love with Hondas. And the engine also likes to rev. This was an engine, again, that was far beyond its times in terms of emissions back in the day, because it was the CVCC engine, which didn't require a catalytic converter, which was a nice, touch for, back in the day, back in the 70s. But I mean, overall, this car was the start of the whole Prelude craze, and it's pretty easy to see why so many people fell in love with the design when you drove this thing. It just feels like a car that takes you back in time. But you know what? I'm gonna hop into the 3rd generation model because that's when Honda added fuel injection. And I wanna see how it performs, especially since I've never driven an SI with an automatic transmission. So skipping a generation here, we have hopped into the 1988 3rd generation Prelude, and I want to just hop into this one specifically because this is the first time that I'm driving a Honda SI vehicle that has an automatic transmission. Also, the engine here was enlarged to a 2-liter double overhead cam fuel-injected 4-cylinder. It made 135 horsepower back in the day, but this vehicle still was relatively lightweight at around 2,400 pounds, so it's gained roughly 400 pounds compared to the first generation that we were at. So the one thing I love about this generation is the visibility got even better. The dash sits nice and low. You have that little storage shelf on top of the dash, and the windows are huge along with these really thin A-pillars, which is just fantastic. Now this model that we're driving just crossed over 14,900 miles, and then when you put your foot down, it actually is surprisingly peppy. I mean, it's a naturally aspirated engine. The engine loves to rev. I love the fact that it's fuel injected because it's a smoother, more refined engine. It's easier to live with. But for a 4-speed auto, it actually, I'm impressed. It actually does a good job at downshifting and putting you into a better gear to kind of bring the engine to the meat of its power band. The top speed, or the speedometer for this car, went from just 80 miles an hour in the first gen going up to 140 miles an hour in this model here. So that's kind of impressive. You also now have a passenger side mirror. But really what shocks me about this generation is the visibility. You can see so much better out of this vehicle versus even the first generation model. Let's try the turning radius. Of course, we now have power steering, so the vehicle turns on a dime much easier. And it just, to me, feels like I'm driving like an old Acura Integra. I love the look and feel. I also love when you turn on the headlights. Just look at those pop-up headlights. That's freaking awesome. That is nostalgia there. That's one of my favorite features back in the 1990s. And you also have plenty of simple controls with this car. The automatic transmission is incredibly smooth. And then when you really want to push this engine, the... Oh. Listen to that. This thing is just, it purrs. It purrs like so many Honda engines back in the day. And even though I would have preferred a manual transmission, I don't actually hate this automatic. I mean, Honda made really good transmissions back in those days. You also had like a sport mode here, which also included like another second gear. You could just lock it into second, or you could also push this button and lock it out of overdrive, I believe, for S4. No paddles or any kind of manual shift mode, but there is just something about this car that is surprisingly good. The steering also is quick, responsive, and direct. The ride is also still great as well, even though we went up to a bigger 14-inch wheel. This car soaks up the bumps really nicely. It feels tight. It feels very playful. It feels very sporty. This model that we're driving does not have the 4-wheel steering. Remember, this is the generation that included the mechanical 4-wheel steering, but we do have the double wishbone front suspension, and I have to say the double wishbone suspension in this car really transformed the handling dynamics. It feels much more like a sporty car, but at the same time it's still a grand touring car, which sets the stage, of course, for the next generation, because that generation does have the 4-wheel steering, even though it's electronic. But thankfully we'll also switch back into a manual model for the 4th generation we're about to hop in. So now we're back in a proper manual transmission equipped Prelude, the 4th generation model. This one happens to be a 1993 with the H23A1 4-cylinder. So it's a double overhead cam, 2.3 liter 4-cylinder that makes 160 horsepower. So a solid 25 more versus the Prelude SI that we just hopped out of for the 3rd generation. And of course, with this new generation model, this model that we're driving has their 4-wheel steering system. So it's their electronic 4-wheel steering system. And this is where the system, apparently, if you turn it a certain amount, it will turn the rear wheels in the same direction as the front. But if you turn it over 140 degrees, I believe, that's where it'll turn the rear wheels opposite of the front wheels. Although this system went to an electronic 4-wheel steering system as opposed to the mechanical system of the 3rd gen. But in reality, with this car, with how small the Prelude is, you don't really necessarily need 4-wheel steering. It helps the car a lot when you're parallel parking the vehicle in a tight parking situations. But what I love about this engine is, it loves to rev. And even though it doesn't have VTEC, I mean, you could get VTEC. I think the sweet spot for the Prelude would probably be this 4th generation with VTEC. It still feels very peppy. I mean, this car back in the day was pretty powerful with 160 horsepower. You could expect a 0 to 60 time in the mid 7-second range, I believe, especially with the manual transmission. This model that we're driving only has 525 miles, so really low mileage for this model. It practically still feels like a new car. I'm just shocked at how well this thing feels. Now let's go ahead and test out that four-wheel steering, and you can actually see it move when you're actually turning the wheel. Man, that turning radius is tight. That's really great. See, that's where the four-wheel steering does a great job here at, in lower parking speed situations. I love that. And also let's talk about the gauge display, because this was a controversial thing, but you know what? I love the green color. I love how it's still right in my line of sight. I can just glance down easily. Now, granted, it's not quite as, classic as the traditional analog dials that you see from the previous generation, but this is different. You definitely have more of a luxury car feel. I like the seats in this car. The leather also feels nice, but no cooled seats also is kind of a bad thing in this hot weather, but still will rev all the way to 6,000 RPM. That's nice. I love the way this feels. I really would love to drive the VTEC equipped version of this car. Sadly, Honda doesn't have the VTEC model. If you want to drive the VTEC, the 5th generation that we were filming earlier has it. I've technically already driven that model, so because we're a little low on time, I'll leave the driving portion out of this video here. But if you want to watch us driving that vehicle, you can actually click on the link in the description below, where we'll have a full review on just the 5th gen model. Brakes also feel really good. They have a nice progressive linear feel to them. And in general, this car feels a lot more modern. In fact, this generation has such a different feel to it. It feels more like a modern car, where I can drive it a little bit harder. It takes the bumps a little bit nicer. It's got the fully independent double wishbone suspension. It's got that trademark handling feel. And I also love this steering wheel in this car. I actually think I like the steering wheel in this model more than the 6th generation Prelude, although I kind of wish that Honda went to a 3-spoke design. But I mean, overall, this generation, even though it didn't quite get the love of the 5th generation or the 2nd or 3rd generation, I think this might have my favorite interior. And remember, the sweet spot is probably going to be the VTEC equipped version with this car, because it is lighter versus the 5th generation model. So in the 22 years that Honda offered the Prelude nameplate here in the States, the company actually managed to sell a little over 826,000 units total. That's of course running from the years 1979 to 2001, which is no small feat considering the fact that this is, again, a sporty 2-door coupe. It's not necessarily the most practical vehicle, but it really showed just how popular 2-doors were back in the day and just how popular the Honda Prelude was back in the day. But let's go ahead and start talking about the pricing of these vehicles back when they were new. Starting, of course, with the iconic 1st generation model over here. This model, when it was out in 1979, had a base price of around $6,500, which, again, if you adjust that for inflation, it certainly is a very cheap amount of money. Honda managed to sell around 171,000 units total from basically the years 1979 to 1982. The model behind me, however, was the radically redesigned 2nd generation. Honda managed to sell around 336,000 units. So this technically was the best-selling generation of all time. For the Prelude, base price for this vehicle back in 1983 was just under $10,000. So obviously inflation, this vehicle got a lot more technology, a lot more creature comforts, a lot more features. But again, this was the generation that Honda sold the most of, at least here in America. Now, of course, the 3rd generation was kind of like a evolutionary change from the 2nd generation. Honda said pricing for this model, when it was out back in the mid-1980s, or in the late 1980s, started at around $14,000, ranged to around $17,000. The company managed to sell around 160,000 units, so about half the sales figures technically of the 2nd generation. But this is kind of a time period where Honda started to introduce more coupes to their lineup, and the market was also starting to shift more toward SUVs. Now, following up, of course, the 3rd generation was the radical 4th generation Prelude. When this generation came out in 1992, it essentially started out at around $16,000, went up to around $20,000 or $21,000. Honda sold around 98,000 units total in the States. So this is kind of where we started to see the Prelude sales start to fall, because again, they started to introduce vehicles like the Civic and the Accord coupe. Acura had several coupes in their lineup, but moving over into the 5th generation model, this was the last year or the last generation of the Prelude. This was also, of course, the most powerful, the most expensive. Honda did around 58,000 units in the US from generations of 97 all the way up to 2001. and the base price back in 1997 was around $23,000. So again, this was the most expensive model, but after spending the day driving all the generations of Preludes, I have a lot of thoughts that I want to share. First of all, I think personally the most nostalgia where I think these vehicles feel the most like a Prelude started with the third generation. Went to the third generation and then went up to the fourth and the fifth generation. When Honda added the double wishbone suspension, that's when they really improved the handling characteristics. And of course, when they added the VTEC engine, that's where you have that high revving motor that had almost 200 horsepower. I think the sweet spot is probably going to be the fourth generation with the VTEC engine option. Sadly, this one doesn't have it, but you have a lot of that fire that you feel from the fifth generation, but in a car that's a little bit lighter, that feels a little bit more mechanical. I also love the interior of this model, which also gets me thinking, what is the new version going to be like? Again, we will be driving that vehicle sometime in early January of next year. And while Honda wasn't ready to quite talk about pricing just yet, we can go ahead and speculate, because in my first look video out in the studio, I was estimating they have to get the price under $40,000. We don't know as of this filming still, but I think if Honda could get the pricing right for, again, around $35,000 to $40,000, we could very well have a vehicle that carries forward the Prelude's nameplate into the modern 21st century. Because as you guys know, the Prelude has always been the legacy of innovation. The company has always used the Prelude's name to introduce a lot of modern tech. With the all-new 6th generation, it is going to be again the first hybrid model, which will be driving finally in early January, and I'll be looking forward to sharing my impressions of that vehicle when we finally get behind the wheel. But with all that said, hope you guys have enjoyed my full detailed history overview of all 5 generations for the Honda Prelude. If you're also looking to see the latest cars I'm testing, be sure to follow me on Instagram at redline_reviews. Like us on Facebook, and as always guys, please keep subscribing to the Redline Reviews YouTube channel for all the latest reviews. Thank you so much for watching. I'll catch you all in the next video.